Anyway, Senator Colmore apparently listened to my discussion with him. He has acknowledged it, and apparently in some meetings we talked, and I think he got the message that it really is the government's job to guarantee housing for people. I also think the phrase starter homes could be a bit offensive. There's a majority of Utahns that may not ever leave the first home and only home they get. So I don't know that we need to keep calling them starter homes, and you call them affordable homes, but most people don't leave. I've driven around the neighborhoods that have the starter homes in them, and I don't see any for sale. I don't think people are necessarily, maybe it's a generational thing. I don't know if our generation, the ones younger, are looking to go from house to house to house. I don't know that that's the case, but I don't think it's the government's job to make it possible. So that's all I'm saying. Other than that, I'll get off my soapbox, but welcome. Again, we're in I really do think it is a time where you have to just be paying attention. So I'm gonna turn the time over to, all right.
Minutes.
Oh, let me do the minutes. Can I get a motion to approve our minutes from our last meeting, December 11th, 2023? All right, motion by Kate. Is there a second? Do we need second by? All right. All in favor of the approval of the minutes, say aye. Any opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. All right, just go ahead.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mayor. For those of you who are new, I guess we're going to make sure we do some introductions today. Who here is at their first LPC? Anybody? Couple hands up. Okay. Welcome to the new folks. It's okay. You don't have to be hesitant. Everybody had their first LPC at one point. So for those of you who are new, welcome. And I'm sorry. For the fact you even have to be here. But we're going to have some great discussions over the next few weeks. We're going to have some horrible discussions over the next few weeks as we get through the legislative session. But we're gonna get some good outcomes at times and some less than bad outcomes some other times. But this is where the magic happens. This is where we coordinate. So my name is Justin Lee. For those of you who don't know me, or those of you who forgot and didn't want to ask again, I'm Deputy Director here at the League of Cities and Towns. I oversee the advocacy portion of our mission. So you'll hear from me a lot during the legislative session. Anybody forget that the legislative session starts next week? Or did anybody need a reminder on that one? So if you wanted to forget, I'm sorry to remind you, legislative session starts next Tuesday. Anybody know what day the legislative session ends? March 1st. And not soon enough is also a correct answer. I don't know why, but somehow it ending on March 1st psychologically is so much better than later dates in March. It's still the same 45 days, but somehow that's just better. So just to let you know what you're in store for, we will not have an LPC meeting next week. Next week, first week of the session, they don't meet on Monday. We're not meeting next Monday. We do have our local officials day next Wednesday, both at the Capitol and down at the Salt Palace. And we will not have an LPC on local officials day, but we will have a legislative preview. So we'll talk about legislative stuff, but won't be doing any official LPCs. So our first one will be that first Monday of the session. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll have our first LPC at the Capitol. LPCs at the Capitol take place in Senate Building Room 210. So if you go to the Senate building, which is the East building in the Capitol complex, go to the second floor. It's the biggest committee room, but Senate room 210 is where we'll hold LPCs. Same time, they'll start at 12:15 during the legislative session. And hopefully they'll run an hour and a half. Sometimes we get really excited and they run a little bit longer. Early in the session, they have committee meetings, so we get kicked out pretty quickly. But that's the next time we'll see you for LPC. We also have that online. So if you're not available to come that day, or if you have members who want to check it out online, we'll have that option just like we do today. So see you in a couple of weeks for our next LPC. One of the things that we do every LPC is we will start taking positions on bills. So right now there are a few bills numbered, and by a few I mean a couple hundred bills numbered. But we will start taking positions on bills at those legislative policy committees. So if there is a bill that is of particular interest to your city that you want us to discuss at LPC, please shoot us a note, shoot us an email, shoot us a text, call us, grab us, whatever you need to do, and we'll make sure that that's one of the ones that we discuss. We will also show the bill tracker at the end of every legislative policy committee and ask you to ratify the staff suggested positions on bills. So we'll run through that list of 150, 200 bills really quickly, giving you a chance to read all of them in depth and ratify those positions. I should also note that if you have questions about why we have a certain position on any bill, again, reach out at any time. We can explain where the position came from. If you'd like to suggest we change position, then that's something we take to the LPC and we can do that. So that's a quick intro. Welcome to LPC and buckle up. We're going to have a lot going on. So a couple of messages. First off, Mayor Walker did a great job saying, he just talked to Senator Colmore last week, hit him up about issues. We hope that all of you are talking to your legislators, and not just hope, we request that all of you please talk to your legislators about not just individual bills, but about things in general. If you've never talked to a legislator before, the next week is a great time to reach out and introduce yourself so that the first time they hear from you isn't when you're saying, I hate your bill, please vote it down. Always good to maybe have one contact before we blow stuff up. Not a lot, but at least one contact would be great. So a couple of messages we do want you to share, and these are going to look really similar to some messages last year. Last year, our message was the state has a surplus, but cities do not. I'm sure you've heard the news at this point that the state does not have a surplus this year. The state has a tight budget, so do cities. One of the things that we hear from time to time is that we'll pass that cost on to the city can pay for it, city can cover that. You've got property tax, you're going to be fine. We all have tight budgets as well. So that's one of the things we want passed on is state has a tight budget, so do cities. You don't just need to pass things down the road. And then partnership, not preemption. That was our message last year. That's our message again this year. We want to partner to figure out solutions. Do not preempt us on things unnecessarily. All right, we asked this last month. I'm going to ask it one more time. One of the things that happens every legislative session with every bill is that there is a fiscal impact statement done for every piece of legislation. What that means is the fiscal analysts reach out to interested parties, reach out to agencies, and they reach out to us to ask, how will this legislation impact you fiscally? Happens on every single bill. So what we need are some individuals who can respond to us really quickly on our fiscal response team. We had a few volunteers last month. I've got you noted. But if you are interested in helping us on our fiscal response team, we need a small, select, elite group of individuals that can shoot back quick responses when we say, if this bill passes, how would that impact your city budget? And then we can get back some information. And we say quick, we mean 24 hours quick. The legislative analysts, they have 3 days to get the fiscal note done. One of those days is for us to respond. And as we get later into the session, we're turning out fiscal responses in hours, not even days. So if it has always been your lifelong dream to give us fiscal information on a very quick basis, now is your chance. Please shoot me an email or shoot Carson an email. My email, jlee, JLEE @ulct.org, and we'll put you on our elite fiscal response team. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Cameron. And even though I think we say this, most LPCs, one day we're going to try to not have Cam up here talking about housing, but today is not that day.
Thank you, Justin. Happy New Year, everybody. And thank you for joining us between the folks in the room and the folks online. We are well north of 200 people in attendance today. While Carson updates the Slido questions, as Justin indicated, my objective here over the next probably realistically 30 to 40 minutes is to update you on what's happened since we last met in December as LPC. We've also prepared several Slido questions around some of the different concepts that are floating around in the housing space. For those of you online, please use the chat room to put questions in. As soon as Carson gets back to the screen, he'll be able to answer your questions as I'm presenting, or he'll raise his hand so that I can respond to them to the group. Likewise, if you're in the room, just raise your hand. Liam's in the back with the microphone. We'll bring you the microphone. And again, we're going to be giving you the update and working toward doing some Slido questions to get feedback from the overall group. Carson, I'm going to assume that the 50 comments in the chat room are not for me yet. Okay, perfect. Okay, it's always important to give a refresher about why we are where we are. Okay, go ahead and close those down. This is just a quick snapshot of the context at the Capitol. We refer to housing narrative, Capitol, good, bad, ugly. The ugly is still to be determined, but good and bad. So here's a bit of good news. Moderate income housing plan cities and counties. These are cities of over 5,000 required to do MIHP reports. 81 out of 95 are in compliance as of Friday afternoon. We do have the list of the 14 communities that are not in compliance, but they're going through the cure process. So we're not putting their names on the screen because those 14 communities are working through the cure process. So I want to be fair to that process. However, there is a perception that I've heard from multiple people at the State House that some cities and counties, quote, phoned it in and are not actually taking legitimate actions to try to facilitate moderate income housing in their cities. Okay, on the good side, Mayor Walker referenced this, the 190,000 entitled units. Thank you to the cities that responded to Carson's survey request. The governor himself has used this data point, including during an event I was at with him 3 hours ago. Also, Senator Colmore, as Mayor Walker indicated, used the same number as he was talking to this group. I'll talk about their specific comments in a second, but that's the good news. The bad news is anecdotes still drive policy. So there's one particular city, I won't name the city, but one particular city that I've heard about from countless state leaders. It was a rezone petition to allow for a small infill project in a traditionally single family area that was consistent with general plan, yada, yada, yada. Neighbors came out in force, the city council voted no. And I've heard that example from multiple state leaders now about how cities are stopping supply. Never mind the fact that in that particular city, I was able to give them data of all the housing units that city had planned for that were in process. That anecdote drives that example. Okay, good news. Carson's research that many cities participated in showed that 73% of cities have reduced lot size in the last 5 years. I'm going to talk Salt Lake County cities in a second here. So that's really good. That does mean 27% told us that they have not reduced lot sizes, and lot sizes has really become the focus over the last few weeks at the Capitol, in part because of the Envision Utah report that only looked at underlying data, underlying zoning, base zoning. It didn't look at development agreements. And a lot of cities do small lots through development agreements rather than through base zoning. So we've pointed that out, but again, you can see how the narratives start to build. And then last, Commission on Housing Affordability, there's consensus items from this year around modular housing, state infrastructure bank. To the credit of the governor, he's asked for $75 million for that state infrastructure bank. Flexibility for how we can spend CRA and RDA money. Mayor Walker referenced how they're using some of their CRA funds in Draper, but we've been working on some flexibility there to make it easier to spend money for you as cities to spend those set aside dollars to facilitate owner occupied units, and also maybe to have more flexibility in how you spend the money and how long you have to spend the money in order to facilitate owner occupancy. So those are all good things. Bad things, I guess you can't see it because of where this is. So just take my word for it. That folks don't think those CHA items go far enough, both this year's CHA items and what we are already implementing. Okay, so that's your context. That's what we hear every day, repeatedly in our legislative circles. So the Starter Home, First Home initiative, that's the governor's top priority. As indicated, the state budget is tight. The governor wants us to zone for smaller lots. That is his consistent message, including, again, 3 hours ago. But also wants builders to stretch and build smaller homes, maybe with deed restrictions, so they actually are owner occupied and at a certain price point. And it's a matter of, is there a way to get to that outcome? And then, of course, how do you overcome the market forces that are inherent in all of this? Those market forces ranging from land prices, inflation, interest rates, supply chain, labor shortage, you know, all those pieces. And then we've got our principles that the board's adopted and the resolution that you all adopted back at the annual convention. So we're trying to put together all these moving parts, figure out the path forward. You've seen this slide before. We have the housing audit from November. We have the Envision Utah recommendations. We have guiding our growth, where the public said they want housing variety. The state database went live last month. The political urgency, and then unfortunately, when I talk to my colleagues around the country, all the fast-growing states, and mind you, fast-growing provinces in Canada are dealing with this, and whether it's British Columbia, California, Florida, Massachusetts, there are these exact battles happening all over the country. So even this morning, I was exchanging messages with my counterpart in Montana, trying to get some updates on some litigation up there around some of these bills. Okay. So I'm almost done laying out the context, but we recognize there were going to be some new faces who were new to LPC, and so for some of you, this is old hat, but it's important before we get to the Slido questions that everybody's singing off the same sheet of music. We've done a deeper dive into the small lot status quo. Oh, I see Carson raising his hand. I'm so excited to jump into a graph, but go ahead.
Just a quick question from online. There's been a lot of talk about small lots. Is there a specific number or a ballpark number that state leaders have pointed to?
Excellent question. Who is that question from?
Ryan Snow.
Ryan, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And I think Providence has some good examples. Ryan's the city manager in Providence. Providence has some good examples of some recent projects with a variety of housing types and lot sizes. So we mentioned that when we surveyed cities this past summer, 73% told us they'd reduce lot sizes in some or all residential zones in the last 5 years. So Carson, our policy director, has been doing a deep dive. Right now, he's only been able to analyze the data of cities within Salt Lake County. So we acknowledge this is not a statewide representation, but just within Salt Lake County, this is really interesting information going back to 1900. The blue line is the median lot size in square footage. And you can see how through the century, it was by and large almost always above 6,000 square feet. And then it peaked in the late 90s, a median lot size of well over 10,000 square feet. And then it's come down dramatically. And you can see the last few years, the median, and Carson, I'm looking to make sure I say it right, the median lot size of newly developed housing units, median lot size has been approximately 5,000 square feet in Salt Lake County. So you can see last few years how low those numbers are with the development in Salt Lake County. However, the orange line is the total home size. So you can see that the median, this is again median, the median house size peaked before the recession after 2000, so 2006 era, and then it has come down, but it has not come down at nearly the same rate that lot size has come down. And why is that? And this gets back to this data that you presented to us during the summer, that a lot of you are seeing mixed results on when you zone for smaller lots, whether or not you're actually getting smaller housing units on the smaller lots, or if you're just getting big units on the smaller lots. And the market is driving a lot of that. I'll leave this up here for a second longer while I answer Ryan's question. When we talk about small lots, often small lots are in the eyes of the beholder. That said, there are two different numbers that we've heard with the most frequency at the Capitol: 6,000 square feet and 8 units to the acre. And 8 units to the acre is a little smaller than 6,000 square foot lots. So those are the two things that we've heard. And to file those away as we pivot into the Slido questions here momentarily. This is a refresher of the league board's principles that they adopted. I was going to say last year, because technically it was last year, but it was earlier this winter. These are the first 4 pieces around avoiding one size fits all, and then defining starter homes broadly in type and focus on affordable home ownership. And this is really getting to what Mayor Walker was saying a moment ago, that all types of housing and can be starter homes, single family detached townhome condos. And we don't, if we're talking about this missing piece of the market, in some cities that may be single family detached, but in others it's going to be infill condos or infill condos or townhomes. The focus on affordable home ownership with financially sustainable infrastructure. Hold on, I'm getting a text from Steve Waldrop that I want to read. I'm not going to read it out loud. I told him, I told him I was going up on stage at 12:30. So if there was anything else he wanted to clarify from an earlier conversation, it was now or never. So this is actually really helpful. So no, I am not. Yeah, I should. Yeah. No, the key part of this is obviously, quote, obviously still a lot of work to do on the policy. Great. I'll skip all the stuff before that, get back to this presentation, but truly just the content, we were updating all of this in the minutes leading up to LPC because there have been so many moving parts just this morning alone because of all the different meetings that league staff was having or elsewhere. And then we're back at the Capitol at 2:30 this afternoon. So, all jokes aside about getting the text, like it's basically been session-esque through the month of December and last week and today. Okay, so we'd have requirements on local governments, requirements on builders under the league principles. Recognize infrastructure challenges, don't punish cities for things outside of their control, require cities to plan for a variety of housing types, and then If they don't, we could potentially use the MIHP model around the existing consequences. So everybody has a role to play, but it needs to be fair in how we play those roles. Okay, so since December, we asked back in December for a few volunteers. We were trying to get a nice cross section of communities. This is the group that has met 5 times. So while everybody else was making holly and jolly during the holidays, we had this group meet several times the week before Christmas and met twice last week. So thank you to the staff from these different cities. They've been working through the different concepts we're hearing about, some of which we're bringing back to you in the larger group today. So I want to thank the strike team that's been helping us on this front. Again, try to have a cross section of big cities, small cities, built out cities, greenfield cities, so that we get good perspectives from those staffs. Okay, we also have told you when we ask for your Slido feedback, it matters. So today, when we ask for the Slido feedback, we're not going to show the results on the screen because we want to go through and analyze it first to see the results from greenfield cities versus built out cities versus established cities, et cetera. But we are reporting back to you what you told us in December. Because again, it's just helpful baseline info. For those of you who were not LPC members in December, just know that your predecessors on LPC responded this way, and it's very helpful for us as staff. So we asked you, hold on, it's Waldrop again. Okay. We asked you about every city of a certain size, like MHP type cities, being required to adopt a starter home policy with a mix of incentives and requirements to facilitate the construction of actual starter homes. Like we actually want the outcome, right? If it's going to be a painful process for both on the planning side and on the developer side, it actually needs to result in the outcome of more affordable owner occupied units. So what you told us is up on the screen. Hopefully everybody can see it. 57% were very comfortable or somewhat comfortable, with the vast majority of those being in the somewhat space, in part because many of you asked questions about details, which we can't ask via Slido, but again, just acknowledging there's still a lot of nuance to work through, which again is what Waldrop just reaffirmed in his text. And then 36% of you were somewhat or very concerned. So that's helpful because we've been working through some of these concepts over the last couple of weeks that we're going to now bring back to you for your feedback. Recognizing too that Slido is not about bills. So these are all still concepts. Once they get to bill form, then you'll take positions. Okay. And even though we don't have LPC next week, we do have the board will meet at the end of local officials day for a couple of hours, and the board will take positions on bills that have come out that need positions before the LPC meets again on Monday, the 22nd. Okay. Next question that we asked you in December: should cities have flexibility to determine, where should the policy apply within cities? Overwhelmingly, you said cities should have flexibility to determine where. Then there's the fixed minimum, and then the policy enabling starter home should apply everywhere or all zones in the city. So again, you can see you've unsurprisingly said if we're going to go down this path, flexibility is key. And then consequences, what should the consequence be? Again, most people said we already have this built-in process with MIHP. Let's use that process. And as I mentioned before, 81 of 95 cities are currently in compliance. 14 are going through the cure process, though there has been some frustration about whether or not cities have quote unquote phoned it in. Okay. So this has been updated as of this morning. What's highlighted in orange is where I want to draw your attention, because that's where we're going to ask the Slido questions. Rumbling 1 has been updated. So those of you who are here in December, we refer to Rumbling 1, Rumbling 2, and then the League Board framework. And we asked you Slido questions back then that were around 1, 2, and the framework. Today's Slido questions are going to be around Rumbling 1 and Rumbling 3. Rumbling 1 is updated. This is what Mayor Walker referenced in his opening remarks, that the state would say 8 units to the acre everywhere in any residential zone in the state, so long as 6 are price capped and deed restricted to be owner occupied units up to that certain price level. It would not have an impact on areas with development agreements, but it would apply everywhere else. So the state consequence would be preemption. And then at the bottom, you see the market result is unclear. Would these units actually get built? Carson, if I skip the Slido questions to the slide after the Slido questions, I can come back to Slido, right? Okay, good, because that's what I'm gonna do. So this is Rumbling One. It's fairly simple and straightforward. I have a slide that we put after the slide of questions I'm gonna show you in a second, which will articulate all of the arguments we've been making in response to Rumbling number one. Rumbling number two hasn't really changed since we met in December. Rumbling number three, this has come out in the last few days. This is similar to what happened with internal ADUs 3 years ago. And the idea here is, city, you have to designate a percentage of your residential areas that have to allow small lots, townhomes, et cetera. So kind of flexibility in those types of units. So you have to proactively designate these are the areas. They have a pre-approved design process as part of it, but then you'd also have some tools around deed restrictions or limiting house size, again, trying to get to the target outcome of more affordable home ownership. And then depending on how we do those percentages, you could have some nuances in there to take into account what you've already planned for. Again, market result is unclear on this, so I'm going to skip the Slido to here. Okay. Oh, that's actually, this should, yeah, on Rumblings 1 and 2. So these are the main points that our work group who's been consulting with us over the last few weeks. These have been the main points we've been using to push back on Rumbling 1 and Rumbling 2 and the other concepts. So when I say push back, it's we don't want to say no to everything just because. We want to say we want to be true to our principles, which is we want more affordable home ownership. Will these proposals actually have that result? Why or why not? And here are reasons why not. So, we've asked about the 190,000 existing entitled units. Would the state preemption of local zoning actually propel those units to be built? We've asked, what about in those areas where cities have zoned for this density and the market's not building starter homes? They're either not building anything or they're building units that are much bigger. And two of the examples that we've been using quite aggressively the last few weeks has been in Harriman and in Bountiful. Very similar fact patterns, actually. Both communities have zoned for this type of density or higher, and the units that have either been built or proposed to be built there are either selling for over $630,000 or that's the assessed value of those units, even though they haven't been built yet. So again, if there's a state preemption with this type of density, would it actually have the outcome of more affordable home ownership? The third point here, greenfield versus infill. And I mentioned we've got the 12 cities that have been working with us on the work group, but then we asked 3 specific people. We asked Ryan Luce of South Jordan to be the one attorney. We asked JJ Allen of Clearfield to be the city manager. And we asked Angela Price from Salt Lake to be the city planner. She's the government relations director for Salt Lake, but has a background in planning. We asked those 3 to join us in our meetings with Steve Waldrop and the other stakeholders. And this was the primary point when we met a couple of days ago around whether this type of concept in Rumblings 1 and 2 would have any sort of impact on infill communities or areas that don't have greenfield. And their arguments really carried some heavy weight in that conversation. So like, we're trying to do this. We're not getting any sort of affordable home ownership in our communities. How do these proposals actually result in that here? And if the intent is we're just going to double down on all starter homes being in greenfield, what are the consequences from a planning perspective in those areas, let alone on existing infrastructure and everything else? So I just wanted to thank those 3 in particular, because they basically dropped everything to join these nearly daily meetings we were having with Steve Waldrop to bring that frontline perspective from an administration, planning, and legal perspectives. And that gets to number 4 about the infrastructure impacts. If you have zoning density anytime, anywhere, any place, what does that mean for the cost of infrastructure? And that gets to number 5. Do you have the kind of a blanket approach, or do you have a more targeted approach? And again, does it actually result in those units being built? Before I open up Slido, I'll walk through what the handful of Slido questions are for the group, but I've been told I can sometimes talk fast, and I was trying to provide enough context before we jump into the Slido questions. So I'm just going to pause here before we open up Slido to see if there are any questions. Carson, is it you asking or is it someone online?
Someone online, I need to
Great,
run up
that's
because it
really-
looks like Slido didn't load correctly. So Amy maybe asked, do we know what specific things the state feels aren't sincere in what is occurring to meet the required housing standards? We are meeting these, and from what was said, even meeting standards may not be considered sufficient. It would be helpful to better understand where it appears that we're falling short. From our standpoint, meeting the requirements has been highly challenging, and we are fully committed to doing our best, but real examples would be helpful here.
Yeah, Amy, it's a great point. So Amy's in Pleasant View, and the frustration that Amy just described is shared by a lot of different communities. We've heard from a lot of community development directors and those who've been filling out those MIHP reports, similar frustrations. And this is a really tricky piece for us as an organization, because right now within the MIHP reports, there's a lot of subjectivity. And that also brings flexibility for communities. So if you provide more specifics about what success looks like in MIHP, you get away from the quote unquote phoning it in narrative, but it's more prescriptive. So you lose some flexibility. So that's the philosophical challenge. And then you get to what Amy pointed out of the specific examples. Now, we do have a copy of every MIHP report. I have not read them all, but Carson and Meg Ryan in our office have. And it is tricky. So I think the first question that we'll need to wrestle with is the question of subjectivity and flexibility versus objectivity, but more certainty, right? And less flexibility. And there are pros and cons to both those pieces. And up till now, MIHP is really focused more on the first rather than the second. But Amy, right, and Mary Ramsey's pointing out, like, that's what we wanted. She was on the league board when we were negotiating SB 34 in the first place. But there also may be value. There may be value in having, for lack of a better term, some safe harbor provisions within MIHP where Pleasant View could say, okay, if we do this, then we know we're going to be in compliance. So it is more restrictive, or more restrictive is not the right word. Erase that from the minutes. It's more prescriptive, but it also provides more certainty so long as other cities still have flexibility. Like that's a tricky balance. Mayor Walker, Liam, or Cassidy?
Have you had any discussions yet about who will write the check to the developers to buy down these 6 mortgages out of 8? Where's the money coming from? Who writes that check? Has that program been discussed at all?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mayor Walker. This is a critical component. And there are a couple of answers for it. So answer number one, and the first Slido question is about rumbling number 1. It's the 8x6. I haven't opened it up yet because I know as soon as I open it up, everybody's going to start voting. And that's why I want to kind of vet the questions first. I've learned my lesson of a year now of asking Slido questions. So Mayor Walker's asking if there was a statewide preemption that said every city has to allow 8 units in every residential zone. But a developer can only take advantage of that if 6 units are deed restricted at a certain price for affordable home ownership. One argument is that if they can't make that pencil in Draper and there's no offsetting revenue, whether it's from the state or the city or anywhere else, then they just won't build it and therefore they won't take advantage of the zone. Okay, so that's the first relatively simple answer. Now, in practice, it's highly unlikely that what I just described, 8 units, 6 deed restricted, is going to pencil in Draper without a subsidy. Right? And when I say highly unlikely, I should just say impossible. Whereas in a community where land is cheaper, I won't use a city's name, but just a city where land is cheaper, you may actually be able to make 8x6 work without any sort of subsidy, but they still would have the affirmative mandate to have deed restrictions. But then the outcome is what I was describing a second ago, that this tool doesn't facilitate more affordable home ownership in Draper. It just facilitates affordable home ownership in those other communities. And maybe that's okay. Part of the reason we're asking the Slido question of the big group today, and part of the reason we're going to go through and analyze the results before we share them with everybody, is we want to actually break down your Slido results by city so that we have a sense of where there might be support or where there's opposition or both. Okay. The second piece, to Mayor Walker's question is, where does this sort of money come from? And I should have, okay. I took notes from the governor this morning. He and I chatted briefly, and then he was giving a presentation on housing affordability. And for better or for worse, I'm known for taking notes in all my meetings. I have a Word doc where I keep track of all my notes from all my legislative meetings. It's over 300 pages long just from the last few months, but it's helpful to do search find and go back and remind people what they said. So Governor Cox this morning first applauded the league for being willing to engage in conversations. And that's important. We're not to yes on anything yet, but he applauded the league for being willing to sit down and have conversations to achieve more affordable homeownership. He said several things need to happen. One, we need to look at zoning to encourage the right behavior in the right places. Two, he said we need to look at access to capital. Three, he said the financial community needs to lend for these types of units. Four, we need to figure out the infrastructure. The infrastructure is the biggest piece. He referenced our 190,000 entitled unit number. He said a lot of them are missing infrastructure. I'm asking for state infrastructure dollars and want to prioritize lots that will result in affordable home ownership. Five is I'm concerned about institutional investors. I'm concerned about density for rentals instead of ownership. I'm concerned about short-term rentals. So I want to keep these units. If we're pushing cities and we're pushing developers to build these units, I want to keep these units in the affordable home ownership pool. And he said, I'm hearing from a lot of cities that they want this and they get less NIMBY pushback about these types of units than apartments or other things. Okay. So when you just hear that from the governor, that's really consistent with the board principles that I shared a moment ago. Now, back to your question then about how to pay for these things. I followed up with Speaker Schultz this morning because he spoke right after the governor. And part of my conversation with Speaker Schultz is where you at on all of this conversation. And I know we need to figure out a way to pay for infrastructure, because then if you pay for infrastructure, that can help bring down the cost of the unit. And it's a matter of how do we pay for the infrastructure. So that will set up the conversation about lids. It's not lids. Conversation about infrastructure districts. We've got one more slide question there. That's House Bill 13 that's drafted and out, because that's one of the ideas coming out of, like, could we use this to pay for the infrastructure and then bring down the cost of those housing units? And then there's also discussion about using, RDA type tools. But again, there's finite amount of money there too. So the good news is I think everybody acknowledges there needs to be some sort of subsidy. It's just a matter of who and where and how much and which government entity. Yep. And that's why, from the governor's perspective, he's saying if we get the right system, can we get a regulatory system in place that incentivizes builders to build these units? And he actually said at his press conference last month, I need builders to make less money by building some of these units compared to other units. Okay. And if you ever thought you'd hear a governor say that, to me, that's a big deal, because it's at least acknowledging the market forces at play here. Okay, I see a lot of people shaking heads or like rubbing their eyes. Like yes, it's that sort of topic here, and it's only January 8th. Any other context questions before we open up Slido? There's anything online? Okay. All right. So we're going to be asking you Slido questions here about those different rumblings. I'll refresh your memory as we get into them. Okay, so this is rumbling number one. It's the one I've spent most of the time talking about thus far, but 8 units to the acre everywhere, so long as 6 are deed restricted to be price capped and owner occupied. Acknowledging that there are questions of who manages the deed restrictions, et cetera, which Mayor Walker brought up earlier, but just this concept, again, we're not showing the results, right, Carson? We deactivated that, good. But we want your candid feedback, and Carson, everybody signed in as their city, so we can track it that way. Okay, but name more city, yeah. So just be aware, we are going to go back and track it by city so we can see where the differences are, but want you to be candid in how you're responding. Then Mayor Palmer, you should tell Councilmember Shields, this was his idea to not do some of the results in person so people could be more candid. So just let him know I heard him and we thought it made sense for this. Okay, 125. Feel like we're ready to move on. Okay, I'm gonna close this one in 10 seconds. Okay, next. So this is rumbling number 2, which has not changed since December. I'll refresh your memory. This is just kind of a broad brush. Requires city to allow X units the acre or small lots townhomes in Y% of the city. The percentages are still kind of being thrown about here. This would not have any of the nuances around deed restrictions or being able to regulate the size of the unit or taking into account what you've already planned for. It's just, this would be the kind of the simple general policy. The next question will get to those nuances.
And we have a question online.
Okay.
Do lots that have already been zoned that way count for rumbling number 2?
No, not on rumbling number 2. When I get to rumbling number 3, that'll include it. Well, I'll leave it open in case people need to change their answer. So this one is just as a simple general piece, and then rumbling number 3 will be more nuanced. So I'll leave it open in case people want to modify their response. Okay, rumbling number 3. So this is the IADU type framework. X% of residential areas must allow small lots or townhomes, both credit for the planned or existing units in your community and ability to regulate some things in some places. So this is deed restrictions, housing size, right? So it's a more nuanced version to rumbling number 2. But I also want to be very clear about what this could mean in practice. So we shared with you our own data that said in the last 5 years, 27% of cities have not adjusted their lot sizes in residential areas. So for those 27%, like this would mean you would need to make some changes in your land use ordinances. Are there any other clarifying questions or anything else anybody has on rumbling 1, 2, and 3 here? Yeah, we're at 111. We've been at in the 120. So I'll leave this open for just a few more seconds. Okay. All right, I'm moving on to the next one. So which start home requirements would your city be interested in applying on these new housing units? This is a select all that apply. In Slido, we can't do a select all that apply and an open-ended. And Carson, we don't have an open-ended question, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. If there's other ideas that you want, please send them to me. We picked the most common ones that we've seen, or the most common suggestions here. So you can shoot me an email if there's other things that you think would be helpful.
So one thing that's not on this screen, but is a big one, is just the infrastructure piece. And I'll come back to infrastructure in a second, but we've got the next question kind of gets to infrastructure with a specific idea. I think I heard the Bountiful Corner say the option for none, and that's fine too. Interestingly, I had Mayor Walker actually referenced it earlier, and I've had a conversation with several cities about this too. Is that we don't have the ability to manage deed restrictions or anything like that. So if we got to a point where kind of the trade-off was cities you stretch by allowing this type of zoning, and in exchange, we're going to guarantee this sort of outcome. You know, does every city have to opt into the deed restriction piece or not? But again, in a lot of areas, if you don't have some sort of deed restriction, you may not actually get to that price point, but it does require a lot of the administration on the other side. By a quick show of hands, I know Mayor Walker asked this a second ago, but just for our research purposes, we weren't ready when the hands went up. How many of your cities have some sort of deed restriction program now of any sort around housing? Okay, so I've got, keep them up so I can just say, I'm going to say them out loud, Carson, and then just make sure whoever in the chat room says it too. Let's just quickly get this list to make sure we've got it. So I see South Jordan, Park City, Santa Quin, Salt Lake. Those are the 4 in the room. Draper's talking about it with some, yeah, right. Okay. And so I know Moab has something too. If there's any in the chat room, put that in too. Okay, we're over 100. I'll leave this open for just a few more seconds. Okay. This is an interesting concept that has come up in the conversations too. So back in December, the league officers met with Governor Cox, and Justin and I were there with them. And right before we met with him, a bunch of home builders met with him, and he gave us both the same pitch, and both sides said, here are the concerns. And the 2 concerns he heard the most from developers was, well, the big concern they heard first was timing and speed to actually get something built. And that's where this pre-approval concept came up, is in several other states, we have seen examples of where cities ranging from Phoenix, Arizona to South Bend, Indiana, have done pre-approval processes to try to simplify the administrative process for home builders as they're building units. And so the term that gets used all the time is pre-approval, but it looks different. Even Phoenix and South Bend are totally different, but it's both under the pre-approval umbrella. So we asked our work group about this last week. The work group said, well, here are a few things that some of our cities are already doing. And so we wanted to have a sense of how widespread this was in Utah. So if 90% of you say no, that's fine. But the early results from what we've seen in Phoenix and South Bend and some of the other places where we're seeing these pre-approval processes is it actually is resulting in faster administrative processes without actually eroding any sort of local government authority. So we're just trying to get a sense of what the status quo is right now in Utah. So we're at 77. We'll give you a few more seconds to respond. Carson.
There's a few questions in the chat room if you want to address them while people are finishing up this.
Let's do it.
First, is ULCT doing anything to remove or lighten the state overreach on the one-size-fits-all regulation to allow more city discretion?
I mean, that's kind of the focus of this whole conversation, is to figure out where that balance is. So yeah, I'd say basically every hour of my life right now is spent in those conversations.
And then there's a few questions about the how pre-approval would work in Utah when there's no longer really a concept plan.
Yeah.
So we can work through those.
Yeah, in fact, so let me just hit that real fast. Because of the changes that the legislature has done on design standards and subdivisions, and remember, we supported the changes on the subdivisions bill. The design standards, we got to a hard press neutral on it, but it was the subdivisions, that was something we supported. There's been an acknowledgement by some in the legislature that, particularly on the design standards piece, that it would be hard for cities to do some of these pre-approval things because of some of the restrictions on design standards, or even some language around, say, IADUs or external ADUs is hard because of the design standard preemption. So there's been an acknowledgement by some at the Capitol, like maybe we need to go back and tweak and nuance some of these existing laws if they are inhibiting the ability to get this outcome. Still a huge if in that statement, if they would actually pass legislation, but there's at least an acknowledgement there. Carson, what was the next question?
There's been a few people who've pointed out concerns about whether deed restrictions are an overreaching tool and what that does to future resales. Could you just address how that fits into the requirements on cities in that framework?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because when you buy a home, it's the biggest investment that you make in your life. There are some programs that have started up here in Utah that are shared equity type programs. And the shared equity model is basically where the entity and the homeowner both have equity within the unit. So the homeowner picks up some of the equity. So when the homeowner leaves, the homeowner gets some of the equity, but then some of the equity also stays with that underlying unit in order to keep that unit still as an affordable unit. Then there are other things with the deed restrictions that some cities have done around the country where, yeah, you're deed restricted, you're the owner of that unit, but then the unit stays in the affordable housing supply. Is what you don't want. And the governor has said this, he didn't say it this morning, but he said it to us in other meetings, is you don't want a scenario where create a system that has a deed restriction component to it, and it's deed restricted for the first sale, somebody buys it, flips it 6 months later, sells it for $200,000 more, and then that person has now benefited from that starter home, and now that home is no longer an affordable unit. So those are nuances that have to be worked out with any sort of deed restriction program. Okay, last question that we have in slide on. This gets to Mayor Walker's point about how to pay for all of this, and that will pivot back to Justin to talk about infrastructure financing districts. And that is, what do you think about the idea of governments contributing some property tax revenue for housing related infrastructure and to incentivize home ownership when cities own for smaller lots? If this sounds like a CRA RDA type model, that's because it's a CRA RDA type model, but with a focus on first home type development, small lot type development. And so, yeah, let me pause there. Any questions on this type of concept? Paul, Liam, can you hit Paul up? And by that, I mean, give him the mic, don't actually hit him.
Has there been any conversations on what that would do to impact fees for these developments as well? So are you specifically talking about infrastructure that would be impact fee eligible, and what kind of nuances have been discussed to that end?
Yeah, so the nuances, I'll have a better answer for you later this week. But the discussion, this has gotten to the point around both the upfront infrastructure costs and the maintenance of infrastructure costs going forward. So is there a way to essentially create RDA, CRA type thing that's focused on small lot residential development that can provide a revenue stream to help with upfront and ongoing infrastructure costs? So it would not be a replacement to impact fees. It would be an addition upfront and potentially ongoing. Well, I mean, it's all kind of big picture right now, because this is the acknowledgement of Mayor Walker's point of infrastructure costs, both the upfront capital costs and the maintenance costs are a big reason why units aren't getting built. So what can you do to try to address that infrastructure challenge. So any follow-up, Paul? Ish,
I'm
let's go
trying,
to your neighbor, Mark.
I'm trying to get my mind around this. So the state would automatically be adjusting our property tax rate for us, so we could then take that property tax money to then subsidize new growth.
Well, the key word here is think about governments. So it's not just cities. It would be, do we look at all property taxing entities in order to pay for the infrastructure? And then, what is the role of additional state dollars as part of it?
So I guess, let me re-ask this in a different way. We're okay with the state or someone entity adjusting property tax rates, I presume without the truth in taxation process, so that we can subsidize new growth. Because I just want to be very clear, that's what it sounds like to me, and I'm not hearing anything different, and it seems like it's going to just die on another spear somewhere else.
So, yeah. So I hear what you're saying, Mark. I also hear about the spear on the other side. That's why I keep coming back to like an RDA. This would be more of an RDA, CRA type approach, like like tax increment finance. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, say that again, Mark. I couldn't hear you.
If you're doing it as a CRDA, you're taking money from your property tax.
Absolutely.
In the first place, you're either not getting the new growth
Right.
to provide the basic services to support your community.
Or you're robbing your own self to subsidize new growth. I don't see how this works.
Or other property taxing entities, right? Like,
So
Yeah.
how do we sell that argument in a state where most of our taxes is paid to the school districts?
mhm.
So in essence, you're saying we're okay taking the school district's property tax to subsidize housing, which creates an additional burden to the school system. I'm just not tracking how this works in any scenario.
Yeah, you're at,
Districts maybe being the exception.
yeah. So in light of that, then you would put very concerned like this. Again, like what the reason we're asking the question is there's not a bill yet in this space, but there's been a lot of discussion around how to pay for infrastructure. And is there a way to use a variety of property tax levies to get there? So let's go Paul and then Mayor Walker. And then I told Justin I'd be done at 1:20 and that's where I'm at. So
Sorry, I guess just
Paul?
another concern along, if it's not impact fees, it's going to affect then, along with what Mark has been saying, I would be concerned that is the money going to go to infrastructure that the developer is inherently required to put in themselves as part of the development process? And what assurance is there, if that's the case, that's actually going to bring down the housing price to be able to enable a deed restriction or whatever? Or on the flip side, is it going to go to the cities to help with the deficit that oftentimes we experience with impact fees and the infrastructure that we have to put in? So I think that needs to be clarified.
Yep, excellent questions. This is why we're asking the group, because we've got several meetings later this week on infrastructure in general. And we've had several people who've said, well, what about this and what about that? And so we wanted to kind of shotgun it to get some initial feedback. So yes, helpful feedback there, Paul and Mark. Mayor Walker.
So just along the lines of this math problem we're trying to do, as long as the tax revenue is adjusted out of the school district's part, I suppose we as cities can say, well, they get the most, I mean, we get the small chunk
Yeah.
of that money, right? We all spend it on road infrastructure now.
Mhm.
I mean, not all of it. I mean, that's where we're all spending some of our sales tax or our property tax revenue on our operations, including road maintenance, road construction,
Right.
sidewalk installation, all those things. So I guess if they want to adjust, they're talking about taking more from the school district side and putting it just for new infrastructure. Is that what the
Possibly.
proposal?
That's been that could be part of it. It could be additional property tax levies, but again, it's trying to figure out like, where do you get additional property tax to pay for that?
Well, I
exact
can just see the
infrastructure?
truth in taxation hearing at my council meeting when we're raising our city portion to pay for a new subdivision.
Mhm.
That's going to be awesome. I mean,
Yeah, right, yeah.
that'll be one of those great meetings. It might top the homeless shelter meeting for me.
Well, I hope not for your sake. I hope not for your sake. Let's go, Mayor Ramsey, and then we'll wrap up housing. Justin, I'll bring it back to you for infrastructure districts.
Cam, I appreciate you mentioning that there's not a bill with any language drafted yet on this because it's very ambiguous and there's so many different scenarios it could look like, which we're not going to like. I personally am not supportive of taking this out of the school districts, property taxes either. I'm like, it's the coin I played and was on for a long, long time. That's not a good call either. We can't cripple them either. So I appreciate you pointing out that this is not yet drafted. It's something being considered. It's a proposal that's floated. I look forward to learning more as this comes together and appreciate that we'll be at the table to help figure out what that is or
Perfect.
isn't.
Perfect.
One last question. Is it referable?
Legislative acts are referable. So local legislative acts are referable. Again, stay tuned on the details, but the reason we brought it up is because these are the efforts by legislators, good faith efforts to say, cities, we hear you on infrastructure. So what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? In fact, I'll close with this text. I told you that, Steve Waldrop, the governor's homelessness, or that's Wayne Niederhauser. Steve Waldrop, the housing director, said, please reinforce to your members this. The governor wants everybody to play a role in the solution. Build out cities need a different set of tools than greenfield cities. We've got to figure out how to create toolkits that allow for appropriate growth in both, the infrastructure being a critical piece of it. So again, don't have all the answers right now, but because we're having minute by minute conversations basically in this space, your feedback is incredibly helpful. As Carson indicated, we didn't do an open-ended one for the housing stuff, but we do have an open-ended Slido question on infrastructure districts. So if there are other housing related things you want to put in there, that's fine too. Before I turn it over to Justin to do infrastructure districts and the other pieces, this is our Ask for Local Officials Day. You're going to have the opportunity next Wednesday at lunch, ideally earlier if your youth counselors are coming, to meet with your legislators. Number one, tell your legislators what you've done to plan for housing. Number two, how the state can help facilitate starter homes in your city, and infrastructure being the main one. And then number three, why do we oppose state preemption of local land use? What are the practical reasons why that's a bad idea? Infrastructure planning, and then anything else in your community. And then what we'll do next week is we'll remind you of this during the legislative preview prior to lunch. And then we'll be doing returning reports next week and at upcoming LPCs like we've done in the past. We'll put the list of legislators up there and say, okay, who's talked to Representative Thomas Peterson? Who's talked to Representative Karen Peterson? Who's talked to Representative Stephen White? And we'll go down the list to make sure we're getting those returns and reports. This has been extremely helpful for us as staff as we advocate on your behalf. Justin, I will turn it over to you to do infrastructure districts and the rest of the agenda for the next 20 or so minutes. So thanks, everybody, and Happy New Year.
No prediction on the game?
Oh, that's a question you might want to answer.
Utah's 9-12, so you don't care.
Safe. All right. We're going to talk infrastructure districts. Now, you may be wondering, why are we talking infrastructure districts again? And the reason is because we love to talk about it so much. What Cam just talked about there, we all know that one of the big hurdles to anything getting built is infrastructure costs. And so when we have these discussions, Representative Dunnigan and others say, well, hey, what about this tool? So we don't need to rehash too much on infrastructure districts. I think we've gone over the last couple of LPCs several times, and I know everybody read the information sheet that we put out on the agenda in depth and repeatedly. I'm not asking for a show of hands. Quick reminder for anybody who is not up to date. We've had lots of acronyms. Currently, there is a bill drafted. The bill is HB 13, Infrastructure Financing Districts. Okay, is what we're calling it. Basically, it says that a landowner with 100% of property owners can create an infrastructure financing district. District is separate and distinct from other political subdivisions. Board members don't necessarily have to be residents, mostly because in a lot of these cases, there would be no residents. Property tax rate would be 0.0004. Property tax revenue may not be used for the repayment of the bonds. The lien on the unit has to be paid off before a certificate of occupancy is issued, and there is specifically no eminent domain authority. Special district cannot levy or collect tax revenue that exceeds the certified tax rate unless there's an elected board of trustees. And no later than 180 days after all the debt is paid, the district is dissolved. That's what the infrastructure financing districts do in a nutshell. So last month we asked what the support looked like for this. So LPC support for the proposal as stated, nothing has changed since then. 52% were somewhat concerned about the proposal. 10% were very concerned, 5% very comfortable, 24% were somewhat comfortable. So the reason we're going to come back and ask a question similar to what we asked last time is we're having all of these housing discussions, infrastructure financing discussions. This bill may or may not get lumped into the larger discussion about what this all looks like. Last year, when the DIDS bill came out, which is different than the LIDS bill, but doesn't really matter. When a similar version of this bill came out last year, we were able to shoot it down very handily and fairly quickly within a couple of days of coming out. One of the reasons that we were able to do that, other than we had a great talking point, which was, do you want to give an unelected board taxing authority, was we hadn't shot a lot of bombs yet in the legislative session. We heard from several legislators that if you haven't seen one yet, you hadn't really put out any action alerts. You hadn't said, go kill this bill. And when we did, it was very effective because they said, oh, they really care about this one. This one matters. We may have a lot of bombs we need to throw this session. So we may not have as many big wins that we're going to get shooting out an action alert as last year. Now, I'm not saying we're going to lose either. I don't want anyone to say, oh man, we're giving up on anything either. But we also need to be aware that we will have a limited amount of ammunition and we may be digging down to the bottom of the barrel for all the cannonballs we have on this one. So, and we're also dealing with Representative Dunnigan, who politically works things through a little bit differently. So just need to be aware of the landscape on this one. Again, not saying we're not going to win, but the question I have this month is, given what we know, back to Slido, what issues still need to be addressed to resolve your concerns with infrastructure financing districts? Now, it is completely acceptable to say there's no issue that you could resolve other than the bill going away that would resolve my concerns with this. But if there are specific issues that still need to be addressed, housing affordability has been brought up before, building permit instead of certificate of occupancy has been brought up before. But if there are specific issues that you still want addressed, Representative Dunnigan is in fact interested in knowing what else he could do. And not saying he would either, but what else could be done to make this more palatable. Now, again, want to reiterate, if there's nothing that makes this palatable, that is fine. And that is a completely valid response. But just want to have one more response on this one before we get into session. The bill is, again, HB 13. It is drafted. It went through an interim committee, which means we could see this bill show up very early in a committee in session. So instead of having this discussion, the very last LPC of the session, we may not even have another LPC before this bill comes up in committee. So we're asking for feedback one more time as we get there. And as Cam mentioned earlier, we'll have a board meeting if we need to take a position before we hit that LPC on the 22nd. So I'm going to leave this open for just a couple more minutes. Just kidding. I'm going to leave it open for like 30 more seconds. Yeah. Doing.
Can you help me understand how this provides cheaper capital, how it provides cheaper money? It still doesn't make sense.
Well, the answer they would give is it's a lower interest rate because they get the public bond market. So lower interest rate equals cheaper capital.
Really short term money, right? I mean, if it has to be paid off so quickly, why is the bond market helpful?
So that's a good question. And we've asked that question as well, is basically, would it work? Would anybody even take this up? They're convinced that somebody would take it up. Whether or not that's factual, I don't know. But yeah, absolutely a concern that's been brought up. And I think it's a valid concern to keep bringing up. All right. I don't see anyone left typing. So, oh, we do have a couple more. Oh, as soon as I said that, a bunch of people started typing. Everyone was thinking right then. Carson, if I jump off the slide, it stays open, right? Or does it close? We'll leave it open just for a second. Now, we also know that the House is having an all-day caucus meeting tomorrow. And I know that a lot of the housing discussion is going to come up. This bill is also going to come up in their discussions. So we're also going to get a better feel in the next day or so about whether or not infrastructure financing districts is in fact going to be connected to the housing discussion, or whether we're just having two separate discussions at that point. Whether it all gets lumped in together, whether it's all separate, we'll have a better feel for that in the next couple of days as well. Yes, Mark.
So how do we know? When my building inspectors are out there, how do they know not to issue occupancy?
That's a good question.
Because fundamentally, we're talking about potentially thousands of units in our municipalities. Some of our cities have a lot of growth left in them. Which homes does my building inspector need to know this on? And is there penalties? Is there indemnification? Is there immunity if we happen to screw up and issue occupancy on something like this? You're mirroring two worlds that are vastly divergent. Building officials and building inspectors, they don't do finance. And finance and deed restrictions and other things, they're not paying attention to that anything. They're just saying, does it meet the International Building Code to get occupancy? So I think we're stepping on a landmine unless we can get some clarity in that resolve.
Okay. Did you throw that one in there? Did you? Thank you. Appreciate that. Not that I won't remember, but that would be awesome. Yeah, Paul.
I think one of the issues that you're going to have is with the issue that Mark just brought up, you're going to have the developers who are going to say, hey, we have to get the income from the sale of the home in order to be able to pay off that assessment. The preference is to have it done at building permit, but that's what they're going to say is, well, we don't have the money for that to be able to pay out that assessment. So if you wait till a certificate of occupancy, then it's the homeowner or the future homeowner that's going to put pressure on the cities to say, hey, you've got to let this go. You've got to relinquish this so that I can get into my home. And yet if the builder or the developer has not paid that off, or we don't have assurance that it's been paid off, then all that pressure is going to be on us.
Right. And now you're keeping
the
someone out of
homeowner's
the home,
gonna
not
hate
just,
us.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that, I agree with that. That one's been brought up as well, but it's a good point. A building permit, you're dealing with the developer or the builder. Occupancy, you're telling someone you can't move in for something that's not really in their control. Yeah. All right. We have a couple more things we want to cover. So I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to type whatever you're typing.
Hey, Justin, there's one question online asking about how many PIDs are out there, how many PIDs are in cities. It's from Mayor Mike up in Garden City. And we actually asked this question of Zions Bank Public Finance recently. And this was a conversation right before Christmas, and they told us that they were aware of more than 90 PIDs that local governments had put into place over the last couple of years. So I don't have an exhaustive list, but I have a list of all the cities that have worked with Zions Bank, and they were aware of more than 90.
Yep. Yeah. Answer the question there. All right. Let's jump on to public safety. Carson, turn that over to you for a minute.
Thanks, Justin. I'll try to move through this pretty quickly. So just a quick reminder, this is a survey that we've worked with Representative Gwynn and the police chiefs and the fire chiefs to run for the past 3 years. This was in response initially in 2021 to concerns about public safety recruitment and retention. We had a lot of extra challenges that year after 2020. So it's an ongoing effort. We try to use these survey responses to help fill in policy. There's already been several proposals this year. I don't know if they've been numbered yet, but there have been several proposals through the interim on different ways to try to tweak state retirement policy to change how recruitment and retention might work. So I don't want to delve too deep into that. We talked about that a little bit in October, but I just want to quickly cover some of the survey responses. For those of you who've been around a few years, I don't think this is anything new. We'll put out a more comprehensive report later this week, but I just wanted to give everybody some quick highlights. So first, this year we had about 1,000 complete responses. We had a few more partial responses, primarily municipal police and fire. It was shared with sheriff's associations, the sheriff's office, and some other law enforcement agencies, but not quite the same response rates. And then, a lot of similarities with the prior 2 years. So one of the questions we asked is, we asked respondents what reasons they were considering leaving service if they were. Some of these respondents were considering going towards another public safety agency. Some were looking at going to the private sector. It kind of runs the gambit, and we'll do some more crosstabs on that. But just at kind of the top line, we asked them to rank them. So one, lower numbers are considered the bigger reasons. So higher wages, unsurprisingly, was the number one reason that respondents picked on average. This makes sense, especially for respondents interested in going to the private sector. Retirement benefits is right there at number two, followed closely behind by lack of support from elected officials. This was kind of an interesting theme that we saw woven throughout, where starting in 2021 with that survey, and I think it's generally improved, but you do see some morale concerns from certain public safety officers as to feeling unsupported, either through compensation or through just the general feeling around the country for what primarily law enforcement does. So you can kind of see there, benefits other than retirement are pretty low. Portrayal of law enforcement in the media. This is one that was higher in some previous years and has since fallen a little bit.
We have a question over here, Carson,
Yeah.
for you.
Hey, Carson, I'm just a little confused, and maybe it was the way the question was asked in the survey versus the way it's portrayed here, but
Yeah.
number two, increased retirement benefits. The way I look at that, I read that an officer is considering leaving the profession so that they can get better retirement benefits elsewhere, which doesn't track to me because there is no better retirement than public safety.
Yeah, so you're reading that question correctly. I don't know exactly how respondents answer. There's some text responses, but generally I think it's at least perceived that you can get better net retirement benefits. And I think there's a split here between tier 1 and tier 2 employees. About half of respondents are tier 1, half of respondents are tier 2. We haven't finished breaking all the questions down by that framework, but I think you'll see kind of a split there amongst those different groups. And I'll add, the perception of a lot of state leaders is if we have improved retirement, people want to stay in the system longer, particularly tier 2 employees who were having a harder time recruiting. Overall job satisfaction, we asked people to just rank it, whether their job satisfaction was high, moderate, or low. Again, this is a multi-year field. And what we saw was in 2021, job satisfaction, people ranked that lower, where moderate was the majority class. And then in last year and this year, we've seen that improve. We've seen people have higher job satisfaction among respondents. So I think that's a positive sign. It's not a gigantic shift, and it's kind of a consistent trend from last year. So we suspect that some of the initial year was sort of the cultural sentiment around public safety at the time and may have been kind of an anomaly, but we're still kind of digging through that. Funding prioritization. This is one of my favorite questions. We asked respondents if they were if they were running an agency, how would they allocate $100 to retain employees? So we had a couple options here. First, pay increases. This was by far the most popular. So on average, public safety officers would put, I think it was $37 into pay increases to try to retain employees, and retirement benefits was followed behind that, but by a decent margin. And you see some other metrics like increases in healthcare, that's around 14%, so much lower. And I think what this tells us, though, is that public safety officers tend to prefer to see pay increases as the primary driver for wanting to keep them. And I think most cities and surveys that we've done previously indicate that that's where investments are going in towards increasing pay. And I just kind of want to close on agency morale, because I think this is a really important factor as well. This is similar to the question on job satisfaction, but again, in 2021, we saw that morale was much lower, where most respondents disagreed with the sentiment that morale at their agencies was high in 2021. And we've seen that improve, which I think is a big factor for retention. Again, we're kind of breaking it down by whether these are tier 1 or tier 2 employees, whether they're looking at retiring or not. But we think just on some high level analysis, so this is a big contributing factor into retaining employees, and that kind of fits other industry standards. So again, I don't think anything here is groundbreaking. It probably fits with what you hear from your own chiefs and officers, but we just wanted to provide you kind of a quick summary before we release kind of a more comprehensive report. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Is there a breakdown of demographic information on like sort of, did we correlate that?
Yeah, I got it. The question was, is there a breakdown by demographics? And I think we had 11 demographic questions. I didn't want to include those all here because that would make this a much longer presentation and we could spend the whole LPC talking about that, but we'll do some cross tabs there and some of the responses. So if there was a big difference this year, we'll break that down by demographics to see what changed and hopefully provide some more insights. All right, well, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Again, we're aiming to get a report out by the end of the week. Thanks.
All right, in the last couple of minutes, we're going to run through a couple of bills really quickly. And again, if you're new to LPC, this is how it works. We fly through bills at the end. So one, HB 138, Lobbyist Disclosure and Regulation Act amendments. Mostly want to bring this one up because it's a bill we think is really good. What it says is a lobbyist cannot reach out to, if you're an elected official and you're a part-time elected official and you have a day job, they can't reach out to your day job and try to influence your employer to have you influence a bill. Now, you may be saying this should have been in the law for a very long time, and you're right. It should have been in the law for a very long time. The other reason I'm bringing this up is if you're new to reading bills, I want to show you what that looks like. So you see on lines 28 and 29, the crossed out language, that is the language that is currently in the law and is being removed by this proposed bill. So it used to just say you couldn't reach out to a legislator's boss and have them do anything about a bill. Now it's expanded to legislature, legislative body of a local government, or board of education. So we think this is a great bill, big fans of this bill. If anyone wants more detail on it, talk to Kate Bradshaw about it. But this is a bill that we fully intend to support. So when you see the bill tracker, this one will have a big old support by it. But that's what that bill does. And that's how you read a bill. So with that small primer on how to read a bill, I want to talk about another quick bill, Scenic Byway Program by Senator Harper. This is SB 28. This went through the interim legislative committee, the Transportation Committee. But right now there's a Scenic Byway committee, and what this bill is doing is changing the process by which bills would go to the Scenic Byway Committee and what that committee looks like. So what this bill would do, SB 28, would say, if a local legislative body wants to submit for a designation removal or nominal proposal to the Office of Tourism for the designation of a scenic byway or the removal of a state scenic byway, they can shoot that up to the Office of Tourism. And I know this is a horrible slide. I just grabbed a bunch of text, but you can see it's all underlined, which means this is all new language. So the Office of Tourism before that gets a committee together. The committee reviews the proposal and then either endorses or rejects the proposal for a scenic byway, either nomination or pulling that away, and then sends that to the Transportation Interim Committee before October 31st for the legislature to approve that. So who is on the Scenic Byway Committee? Committee shall be temporary, meet as needed by call of the chair, and consist of the following, no longer 13 members. See, that one's crossed out. So by the following members. So you can see a representative from the Managing Director of the Office of Tourism, one representative appointed by the Executive Director of the department, one representative from each county where the proposed scenic byway exists, appointed by county commissioner, legislative body of the county. Then one representative appointed by the executive director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. And just so you know, when we have things that are elected by the executive director, we also take those to the board of the League of Cities and Towns to get approved and ratified. And then one representative of the outdoor advertising industry appointed by the executive director of the governor's office of economic opportunity. So that is who would make up the board. It would be temporary. They would take the recommendation and either accept it or reject it and then send that to the Transportation Committee. Currently, the Scenic Byway Committee is a standing group. It has 13 members. They meet to review these kind of proposals, but this is the change. So a question I have for you now, this is like a little practice on a bill. Any concerns with this proposal or the makeup of this committee or what this process does from anybody who is invested in the scenic byways? Yeah, Cam.
Perfect. A couple of questions online. First, Paul Larson from Brigham City is asking if it's originating with the billboard industry. And then the second question is from Kim Bell in Sandy asking is SB 28, really about changing scenic highway designations to allow for new outdoor advertising in those areas. And then Cliff from Eagle Mountain adds, does this mean that billboard industries get a vote? So all kind of coming together.
All of us coming together. Yes, I think if you look at E on line 223 or 233 there, one representative from the outdoor advertising industry. So yes, I think you could say they will have a vote on these now. I don't think you can say they have a majority vote, but yes, they would have different influence than they had under the previous one. Whether that's where this originated or not, I don't know. We'd have to ask Senator Harper and have him answer that. But I think certainly there's an indication that they're looking for some influence there. So yeah, I think that's the answer to those questions. They would have a vote. They don't have a majority vote, but there is some influence there that wasn't there before. Now, that being said, the one other answer I will say is having a seat on a committee and having influence are not necessarily the same thing. You can have a whole lot of influence if you are a paid lobbyist without having a seat on any committee. So I don't think anyone should think that there is no influence from the Outdoor Advertising Commission right now. So not taking position on this one right now, but yeah, any other questions or comments on this bill? Or anyone, we actually could take position if you wanted to. But we can wait. JJ, yeah.
I would just love to hear the senator's response to the question, why is there even a seat for the outdoor advertising industry?
Yep, and we can ask him that, absolutely. Yeah, Cam, back online.
Yeah, Carson, I've stolen your seat here, sorry. So Councilmember Shumway from Farmington is on the committee right now, so her comment here is, this is the first she said, we haven't heard anything about the changes. I think it's coming from the governor trying to downsize committees. That's all I've heard so far. Councilmember Karen Malkovich in Woodland Hills references, scenic byways need to be scenic. And then Paul again up in Brigham City. Well, I assume this is tongue in cheek, but I've already started, so I might as well finish. Could they include a representative of the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance? That is not the league's position. That is Paul making a quip, but.
So the couple comments I'll make on there is this is not the entire bill. I didn't put the entire bill on the board. If you want to go read it, SB 28, there are still criteria that need to be met to approve one of these scenic byways. So such as being scenic is in there. So there are some criteria there. And ultimately, yeah, it goes through the legislature for approval or disapproval on this one. But again, really bringing these up for a couple things. One, these are bills. If you haven't read a bill before, it is crossed out if it's old language, it's underlined if it's new language. And we'll bring those bills to you to take positions on. The other couple things I want to say, I know we're over time. One, we don't take positions until we have bill language. So like today, we did a lot of Slido questions. That's what we do when we don't have a bill. If we can't take a position, we're looking for guidance. But once we have a numbered bill, at that point, we can take a position and we'll take position on those bill files. We already talked about the upcoming dates, so we don't need to rehash those again. Just as a reminder, as you're talking to legislators, one, remind them that they don't have a surplus and you don't either. So don't pass on all the costs to you, that we want to partner and not be preempted. And then also tell them all those things that you are doing in your communities to plan for growth, to build housing, all of those things. Please remind them of those. Mayor Walker talked about it earlier, but those conversations do leave an impact. I'm not going to say every legislator is going to listen to you every time, but if we don't say it, they're never going to listen. So please keep that up. Yeah, Carson.
Justin, I just want to add the registration links for the session LPCs are not yet on the website, but we'll send them out in the LPC recap email and we'll post them on the website later this week. So keep an eye out for those.
Okay. And Mayor Walker, I think it's up to you to get us closed.
All right, well, thank you all. Is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. A second? All right, all in favor of adjournment, say aye. We stand adjourned. Thank you.